In the early 1970s, America was captivated by a fictional musical family that seemed too perfect to be real. The Partridge Family wasn't just a TV show, it was a cultural phenomenon. And at its heart were two rising stars, David Cassidy and Susan Dey. Cassidy was the poster boy of teen dreams, charismatic, brooding, impossibly handsome. Dey, with her poised innocence and quiet grace, was the ideal complement. On screen, their chemistry was undeniable. Fans projected their hopes onto them, imagining a behind-the-scenes romance to match their characters. But while millions saw harmony, the truth was far more complex. Beneath the surface, admiration, miscommunication, and unspoken tension were quietly brewing. The public wanted a love story. What they got instead was a slow-burning emotional disconnect, one that would eventually erupt into betrayal, silence, and regret. As the cameras rolled and the theme song played, few knew that what was happening off-screen would one day be more heartbreaking than anything written into a script. Susan's quiet affection. Behind the scenes of the glittering success of the Partridge Family, Susan Dey was navigating a quiet internal storm, one that would never make it to the tabloids but would shape the course of her relationship with David Cassidy forever. While the world saw her as the elegant, reserved Lori Partridge, Susan was a teenage girl grappling with real emotions for her co-star. She fell for David gradually, silently, and without fanfare. He was magnetic, confident, charming, and adored by millions. But to Susan, he wasn't just a heartthrob. He was a colleague she admired deeply, and a man who, in her eyes, carried an emotional weight few others noticed. Friends and insiders have hinted that Susan often suppressed her feelings, careful not to disrupt the working environment or make herself vulnerable. Her love, if one could call it that, was never loud. It was written in the way she looked at him during interviews, in the small kindnesses on set, in the patience she extended even when his attention wandered elsewhere. She never confessed her feelings outright during the show's peak, but those who were close sensed the emotional investment. For Susan, this wasn't just a crush, it was hope wrapped in restraint, a longing anchored by professionalism. And yet, that quiet affection would go unreciprocated for years, until one fateful moment when she finally made her feelings known, and everything changed. Cassidy's double life. While Susan Dey was quietly nursing feelings that remained hidden, David Cassidy was living a life that was anything but private. From the moment the Partridge Family became a breakout hit, Cassidy was thrust into the blinding spotlight of teen superstardom, and the weight of that fame began to fracture his identity. He was the dream of every teenage girl in America, his posters plastered across bedroom walls, his name screamed by crowds that mobbed his every appearance. But behind the polished image and feathered hair was a young man deeply conflicted about the life he was leading. David wanted to be taken seriously as a musician and actor, yet he was trapped in the bubblegum packaging of a teen idol. He resented the fame that had made him rich and adored, because it felt hollow. He was surrounded by fans, but emotionally distant from nearly everyone. And in this state of internal tug-of-war, he lived a double life, polite and professional on set, but wild and reckless off it. His romantic life was a revolving door of adoration, short-lived encounters, and casual flings, none of which left room for something deeper or more sincere. For someone like Susan, who was thoughtful and emotionally reserved, David's chaotic lifestyle sent a clear message. Whatever feelings she had, they would not be met in kind. His inability, or refusal, to see her affection wasn't just hurtful, it was a sign of just how far apart their emotional worlds had already drifted. And the deeper he plunged into fame, the harder it became for him to see what was right in front of him. The one-night stand that changed everything. By the time the Partridge Family had wrapped and the cast began moving on with their lives, Susan Dey and David Cassidy found themselves at an emotional crossroads. The show that had kept them bound in daily proximity was over, and so were the careful boundaries that had, for years, kept their unspoken tension in check. It was during this uncertain period, when the cameras had stopped rolling and the spotlight had dimmed just slightly, that something finally happened between them. According to multiple reports, including Cassidy's own admission in later years, he and Susan had a single night together. For Susan, it wasn't casual. It was a culmination of years of restrained emotion, a chance at something real, something meaningful. But for David, it was little more than an impulsive moment in a life filled with them. He dismissed it almost immediately, and with that dismissal, shattered something fragile Susan had protected for so long. She had hoped that night might finally bridge the emotional gap between them, that maybe David would see her for who she truly was. Instead, what followed was coldness, indifference, and eventually betrayal on a much more public stage. That one night, which could have marked a new chapter, became the final nail in the coffin of a relationship that had never fully begun. It was no longer just unreciprocated affection. It was rejection, dressed in silence, and it hurt more than Susan would ever publicly admit. But the true sting was still to come, when David would take their private moment and turn it into a spectacle for the world to read. The ultimate betrayal, his memoir. Years after their brief encounter, when the fame of the Partridge Family had faded into nostalgia and its stars had moved on in vastly different directions, David Cassidy did something that would forever sever whatever fragile connection he and Susan Dey still had. In his 1994 memoir titled "Come On, Get Happy: Fear and Loathing on the Partridge Family Bus," Cassidy chose to publicly reveal intimate details of his one-night stand with Susan, without her consent, and without any regard for the emotional consequences. What should have remained a private, deeply personal experience was laid bare for the world to read, with David reducing their encounter to a few flippant lines that made Susan sound naive, desperate, and disposable. He wrote about how Susan had hoped for something more, and how he had simply lost interest afterward, as if her vulnerability had been a trivial footnote in his rock star lifestyle. It wasn't just careless, it was cruel. For Susan, who had never spoken publicly about the night, the betrayal cut deep. She was blindsided. The dignity she had maintained through years of silence was shattered in a single paragraph. Friends of Dey say she was devastated, not just by what he wrote, but by the fact that he used her for content, for shock value, for sales. This wasn't a man who had simply moved on. It was someone who seemed to take pleasure in undercutting someone who once cared for him. The betrayal wasn't in what he did years earlier. It was in how he chose to remember it. And in doing so, David Cassidy didn't just break Susan's trust. He humiliated her on a global stage. Why David did it. To understand why David Cassidy would expose such a private moment with Susan Dey, one must look beyond the headlines and into the fractured psyche of a man who had never truly come to terms with fame, identity, or the emotional wreckage he often left in his wake. David's decision to include the story in his memoir wasn't just about sensationalism. It was a manifestation of years of unresolved pain, insecurity, and self-sabotage. Fame had not been kind to David. While it gave him the world's attention, it also took something from him: the ability to form deep, trusting relationships. He often spoke of feeling like a product, managed, molded, and misunderstood. By the time he wrote his book, he was no longer the golden boy of teen magazines. He was a man struggling to reclaim control over his own narrative. For David, writing that chapter may have felt like an act of honesty, or even redemption. But the way he framed it, cold, detached, even smug, suggested something darker. Perhaps it was bitterness toward Susan for not needing him afterward, or jealousy that she had transitioned more gracefully into life after fame. Maybe it was resentment that she had moved on with dignity while he was still grappling with the shadows of his own legacy. Or perhaps, in an act of deflection, he shared her vulnerability so he wouldn't have to confront his own. Whatever the reason, one thing was clear. The decision wasn't about Susan. It was about David trying to exorcise his demons in the most public way possible, and in doing so, hurting the one person who had shown him quiet, unconditional affection. Susan's silent strength. In the wake of David Cassidy's memoir and the very public betrayal it unleashed, many expected Susan Dey to respond, to correct the record, to defend her dignity, or to retaliate with her own truths. But she didn't. Susan chose silence, and in that silence she displayed a strength more profound than any public rebuttal ever could. While tabloids tried to stir controversy and media outlets hoped for a dramatic follow-up, Susan never gave them the satisfaction. Those who knew her say she was deeply hurt, but also determined not to let that pain define her. She had spent her life building a career and identity outside the shadow of the Partridge Family, a quiet evolution marked by thoughtful choices, not tabloid headlines. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was restraint. She never stooped to expose David in return or belittle what they'd shared. Instead, she preserved her privacy and walked away with grace. And perhaps that, more than anything, revealed the true measure of her character. While David sought release through revelation, Susan found power in composure. She didn't need to shout to be heard, and ironically, by saying nothing, she spoke volumes. She reminded the world that dignity isn't something granted by fame. It's something you carry with you even when others try to take it away. In the long arc of their shared story, it was Susan's quiet resilience that ultimately rose above the noise, leaving a legacy untouched by bitterness and built on her own quiet terms. The final years and regret. As the years passed and the glow of teenage fame faded into the distant past, David Cassidy's life took a quieter, more sobering turn. The man who had once ignited stadiums with his voice and charm began battling demons that no crowd could cheer away. Alcoholism, financial troubles, and a series of personal struggles chipped away at the legend, until what remained was a man visibly marked by regret. In his later interviews, David often spoke with a tone that suggested weariness, and sometimes guilt. While he never issued a formal apology to Susan Dey, there were glimpses in his words that hinted at reflection. He admitted in one interview that he had hurt people during his rise, and though he didn't name names, those close to the story knew Susan was among them. His voice, once strong and confident, began to carry the weight of missed chances and unspoken amends. As his health declined, culminating in a tragic battle with dementia and liver failure, there was a growing sense that David had finally begun to understand the human cost of his earlier choices. Susan, for her part, remained distant from the public commentary surrounding his decline. She made no statements, issued no condemnations, and quietly continued with her life. A choice that once again highlighted the unspoken grace with which she had always moved. But fans watching from afar couldn't help but wonder, had David finally seen the damage he caused? Did he feel remorse for the pain he etched into the pages of his memoir? And if he did, was it already too late to undo what had been written, both in ink and in memory?